Welcome to the Schlumberger RSDH disassembly video. In this video we will show you how to disassemble an RSDH unit. Before disassembly, please unplug any cables and power cable from the unit. Depending on the revision of the unit being serviced, use a 3/32 Allen wrench or a number 2 Phillips screwdriver and remove all 16 screws from the top lid. Remove 12 screws securing the front panel. Before pulling front plate away from the unit, disconnect the 12-volt auxiliary power cable from the motherboard and top left cable on the KVM and pull to the side of the unit. Being careful not to pull on the serial ribbon cable, grasp the black connectors and disconnect from the motherboard. Next, remove network cables, and using a flathead screwdriver, remove Cisco console cable from the motherboard. Note that the standoffs on the serial and/or VGA ports will sometimes start to come loose and will need to be held by a pair of needle nose pliers and retightened once connector is removed. Remove all USB cables. Unscrew and remove VGA cable. Note location of the 4 nuts that secure the motherboard to the top plate. Remove the 4 nuts from the motherboard. Please note, on earlier revisions, screws were used. Carefully lift the motherboard and disconnect the motherboard power reset cable. Note the location of the locking clip on the Pico PSU. Release clip and carefully remove the Pico PSU from the motherboard. Note, in an earlier revision, power was provided to the motherboard by only plus and minus 12 volts, not a Pico PSU. Using a number 1 Phillips screwdriver, loosen but do not remove the screw securing the KVM to the plate. Remove the gray end cable. Ethernet cable and power cable from the KVM. Resecure the KVM to the plate. Remove the clear cover from the terminal block. And remove the hot or black wire and the neutral or white wire. Due to revision changes, you will need to trace the hot and neutral from the main power switch to the terminal block or power supply and remove accordingly. Next, you will remove the nut securing the ground wires to the unit with a 7/16 socket and ratchet. Remove all tie wraps from the wires that encircle the right and rear side of the unit. Disconnect the plug that supplies power to the fans. Using a pair of needle nose pliers, separate the two red power connectors leading to the Pico PSU. Disconnect all plugs coming from the router power button. Remove the screws that were pointed out in the video to facilitate removal of the top plate. Before removing top plate, move any wires that would inhibit the removal of the top plate. Pull the top plate out of the unit, watching for any wires that might get hung on the plate. Remove all network cables from the router, and you should be able to completely remove the front panel. Remove the power connector from the router. With the top plate removed, remove the 5 standoffs with a 1/4-inch nut driver, and with a No. 1 Phillips screwdriver, remove the 2 screws on the heat sink of the router. In some revisions, there will also be screws. Unscrew them as well. As shown in this video, the standoffs underneath the router might come loose from the bottom plate. Just unscrew them from the router and install back into the bottom plate using Loctite on the threads. turn the unit on its side and loosen the 4 screws shown in the video until the router bottom plate is loose from the unit. In this revision, the screws will remain on the unit due to a crimped sleeve inside and underneath the bottom router plate. This is the inside view after removal of the router bottom plate. The screws will remain inside the unit. The next 2 clips will show the removal of the rear angle bracket that is used to stabilize the top plate. Using a number 1 screwdriver, remove the back 4 screws of the unit. These next 2 clips will show the removal of 1 fan. Repeat the process for all fans. Using a 1/4 inch nut driver and a number 1 Phillips screwdriver, remove each screw from the fan. Note that there is a number of washers behind each fan but in front of the filter. Please note the number of washers on each screw and replace accordingly. Note the washers in front of the filter. In this clip, we will be removing the memory, SATA drive, and the CPU heatsink. Release the clips on the memory, pull it straight up. For the SATA drive, unscrew the small screw. Pull the SATA drive gently up and out. Note that on earlier revisions, an SSD drive was attached to the top plate and under the motherboard. Next, undo the fan power connector on the motherboard. Note that the plug has polarity. Next, remove these 4 screws to remove the heatsink. Using a flathead screwdriver, turn the CPU clip counterclockwise until it stops to release the CPU. Lift the CPU straight up gently so as not to bend the pins on the CPU. Turn the motherboard over and confirm that the CPU heatsink bracket is still attached to the bottom of the motherboard. If it is not, please locate and retain this bracket for later reinstallation of the CPU heatsink. Remove the two connectors located on the power supply by releasing the clip on each plug. Unscrew and remove the screws on the power supply with a number 1 Phillips screwdriver. Note where the ground wire is located for reinstallation. Use a number 1 Phillips screwdriver to remove the screw on the KVM. Do not let the KVM drop down as it is being unscrewed. Remove the red lugs from the side of the PCU and use a number 1 Phillips screwdriver to remove the PCU mounted on the other side of the KVM bracket. Note the sleeves that are on each screw for reinstallation. Remove the two screws on the KVM bracket with a number 1 Phillips screwdriver. If removal of the terminal blocks is needed, use a number 1 Phillips screwdriver. Be mindful of the orientation of the white locking clips for the clear terminal block cover. This concludes the disassembly of an RSDH unit. For additional support, please email support@petrodac.com.